So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar from the NNIDR looking at Investigator and Ideas grants and trying to improve your competitiveness. We're very excited to be running this webinar. We've got a fantastic panel of academics who've been sitting on our Investigator and Ideas grants this year who are going to be sharing their experiences. So just a little bit of housekeeping to start with. Microphones and cameras for participants to be kept on mute at all times. Our speakers will be able to chat by unmuting themselves, and Alicia will also help with this as well. The webinar is going to be recorded. It's currently being recorded and we'll distribute that next week. So you'll receive a link where you can download that via email. And in terms of our panel discussion at the end, or our discussion with Janice at the end, then the way that we're going to facilitate this is that you can write questions in the group chat. So we won't be having spoken questions because we had more than 100 people register for this webinar, and it would just be chaos trying to moderate that. So group chat will be used, and we'll go through that more later on. And just before we kick off, we want to be very, very clear that we are talking about information in relation to the peer review process, not specific information that's being discussed on panels and for specific grants and applications, because this would be in breach of the NHMRC's Act, Section 80. And Janice will just highlight that really briefly as well.
Thanks, Jen. Look, I just asked to say a couple of things. First is that this is not an NHMRC advisory session. It is something that has been put together by the Accelerator Group and the NHMRC National Institute for Dementia Research. So the NHMRC has actually provided its advice on what it sees as the characteristics of a great application from both the Investigator grants and Ideas grants rounds. And of course, we refer you to their advisories rather than this session for that. And as Jen said, we just want to be really clear that this isn't the opportunity to talk about what happened when your application might have been in front of a peer review panel, the kinds of conversations that happened or that were made that would be a breach of Section 80 of the NHMRC Act. But having said that, there's an awful lot of things that you can talk generally about and that will help position people for future rounds. So really pleased this has happened. Thank you very much, Ray Group, for making it happen. And I'm sure it's going to be a really productive hour. Thank you.
Thanks, Janice. So a quick whip through our agenda. So I'm going to highlight very briefly some of the details on the scheme outcomes and changes, both Investigator and Ideas. We'll then go to our Investigator grants panel discussion, followed by our Ideas grants panel discussion. We have a fabulous set of panelists to facilitate these conversations, and we've allowed 20 minutes for each of those. Then afterwards, we'll have an opportunity to go through some of the feedback that the NNIDR fellows have given in terms of their prospects following the end of their fellowship, and Ashleigh Smith will highlight those. So for those of you who maybe aren't directly funded by the NNIDR or don't feel that particular part of the webinar is relevant to you, then you're welcome to log off after the panel discussions are concluded. Once we've finished going through a snapshot of our survey results, then there'll be an opportunity for Janice, who you just heard from, to go through and outline some of the support available through the NNIDR in terms of advocating for fellows, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. So first of all, just to provide some context on the scheme changes, the NHMRC completed a structural review that basically led to the new schemes that have been launched this year. So from Investigator to Ideas to clinical trials and cohorts, etc. And what that structural review determined was that really the NHMRC are trying to ensure sustainability of the sector. And to do that, they want to encourage innovation and creativity in research. They want to provide opportunities for talented researchers at all career stages, and they want to minimise the burden of applying and peer reviewing applications. So the new schemes have been established in a way to try and facilitate and support those three goals. So The information that I'm going to just quickly highlight to you is publicly available via the NHMRC. So this is a PDF that you can download, and we're happy to distribute this with the webinar link as well. And I've just taken some snapshots of the tables that have come out of the Investigator grants. As you would know, IDEAS grants outcomes have not been finalised yet, so we can't go through the same amount of detail and information for that scheme. So for now, we'll just focus on the Investigator grant outcomes from the funding that will be commencing in 2020. So as you can see, the NHMRC received a whopping number of applications, 1857, and out of that 246 were funded. And so this was a 13.2% success rate over the entire scheme, so both the emerging leadership and the leadership levels. Now, the Investigator grant scheme is a people support and project support scheme that is a large amount of the total MREA, so the Medical Research Endowment from the NHMRC. It contributes 40% of the overall funding given. So 1.4 billion was funded through the Investigator. Sorry, the mean budget was 1.4 million. The overall was about, I think it was 365,000. You can see that in the table below down here. I wish it was 1.4 billion, that would be great. So you can see the applications that were received at each level in the second table. So for the 3 levels of leadership, 92, 195 and 478 applications were received. And then you can see the total number of grants awarded and then what the corresponding success rate was for each of those levels. And the same for the emerging leadership levels 1 and 2 just below that. So I think probably the key thing to point out about this figure is that you can see some very clear bottlenecks around the EL2 and the L1 level with the lower success rates at those levels, 7.3% total for leadership 1 and 9.1% total for the emerging leadership level 2. If we take a look at the next slides, the tables here have now been broken down according to the years post-PhD that the funded applicants were, and then also the male, female and gender not stated proportions for each of those applications. So for the L3, it's no surprise that 47% of applicants here were more than 10 years post-PhD. I think the interesting parts are where you look down at EL1 and the leadership 2 levels as well, where you can see that some people are being funded without having received a PhD, so 18% at EL1. And then you can also see that there's some interesting trends around where people are sitting post-PhD if you look at more than 10 years for EL2 and EL1. So 9% of applicants of EL2 were actually more than 10 years past their PhD, which is where the cutoff actually is. So we've got people that are in there claiming career disruption, etc. So this is just something to be aware of, that the figures aren't as nice and neat and delineating as we might expect based on what the selection criteria are. If you look down at the males and females who are funded, you can see that at L3, 49.3% of the successful applications here were for men. And this is something that the NHMRC acknowledged as a gender gap that they're trying to address. But you can see that throughout the other levels, EL1 and EL2, that the gaps are a little bit more equal, L1 and L2 as well. If we then go and look at applications in terms of the specific area of research focus that was being addressed, you can see that the funded rate of basic science applications was about 11% and 10% for health services, and then around 15% for clinical medicine and science and public health. So quite even distributions there. In terms of the proportion of grants awarded, health services you can see is a lot more competitive with 8.1% of applications funded, and that's obviously relative to all of these figures are obviously relative to the total number of applications received. So it's just an interesting figure to note. Again, with public health, a slightly lower percentage of grants there awarded compared to the overall number of applications received. And same with the Indigenous focused grants. So another just way of dicing up the data. We can see that around 22% of grants focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research were funded, which represented 5% of the total overall funding awarded. And then around 63% were looking at researchers who were applicants that were researchers from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent. So just before we move on to the panel discussions, I just wanted to point out a couple of key things. There's obviously been some logistical changes around the NHMRC's processes that have been put in place to facilitate these new schemes. And our panel discussions aren't going to be addressing these because I think they're covered widely elsewhere in the NHMRC's materials. But there are some really important points that I think people, if you haven't already applied in this current year's round, those who are applying next year for both Investigator and Ideas, some of the key changes around Ideas grants, for instance, is that there's no opportunity for rebuttal anymore in terms of responding to assessor comments, and that's again to facilitate applications going through the system more smoothly and reducing that burden on both our applicants and our peer reviewers. So it's important to look at those changes as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce both Dr. Ashleigh Smith and Dr. Louise Mewton, who are going to be talking to us about their experiences as Investigator grant panel reviewers. So welcome, Ash and Louise.
Thanks, Jill.
Apologies. Now, Ash and Louise, do you want to introduce yourselves just very quickly about where you're from?
Yeah, absolutely. Louise, would you like to go first?
Go ahead, Ashleigh.
Cool. So I think a bunch of you guys that know me. My name's Dr. Ashleigh Smith. I am one of the early career dementia fellows funded through the NHMRC. And I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Accelerator group with Associate Professor Li-Fei Lo. Most of my research is pitched around dementia prevention and how we can reduce dementia risks through lifestyle. Over to you, Louise.
Great, and I'm Louise Mewton. I'm the Centre for Healthy Brain and Ageing at the University of New South Wales. I am actually new to dementia research. My program of research really focuses on alcohol use across the lifespan. So I started at the Centre for Healthy Brain and Ageing in 2019, really looking at the role of alcohol use in dementia.
Excellent. So thanks, Ash and Louise. So we've got about 20 minutes just to go through some of your experiences here. So just to start off with, and I'd like to get your feedback, and we'd like to hear about from your experience as both an applicant and as an assessor for Investigator grants, what makes a great application?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off if you like. So I did actually put down a few top tips on what stood out to me as top applications, and hopefully I can take some of my own advice moving forwards into this next round. But certainly one of the big things that stood out for me were clear and concise messaging. This is particularly important given that most of the people sitting on these panels are reviewing between 25 to 35 applications. So I sat on one of the early career panels and we had upwards of 30 applications. So that clear and concise messaging and being on message throughout the application is something that I feel is particularly important. One of the other things that I noted that really stood out for me as a reviewer was obviously a very impressive track record. So a large proportion of the scoring goes towards track record, but it's not simply quantity of publications, it's also demonstrating how you're leading those applications, as evidenced by number of first author publications, number of senior author publications to deliver collaborative research outcomes. That were two top tips from me.
That's fantastic, Ash. And what about you, Louise? What did you notice about what makes a great application?
I think one of the, apart from what Ashleigh has said, which I totally agree with, you really do need to make your messages simple. So I had 30 applications to review, and they were real. There were animal models, there was stuff in HIV and things like that. They were really and epidemiology, clinical trials, and I'm not going to become an expert in all of these different areas. So I think writing about a program of research rather than getting bogged down in details, which your reviewer is unlikely to understand anyway. I think that was something that worked for a lot of people. I think one of the areas that sank a lot of applications that were otherwise really strong was the impact section. So the impact section is really difficult. A lot of people have a lot of trouble writing them. I found them really hard to assess. We didn't have clear guidelines. Basically, we had the same guidelines that everyone had who was writing them. And we actually had several sort of communications from the NHMRC, clarifying things and reiterating these guidelines, obviously because a lot of other people were also having trouble assessing them. So it's really, getting that narrative right in the impact section, picking one cohesive program of research. So a lot of people would choose more than one sort of program of research and discuss sort of a whole lot of different bits. And if that was the case, then you had to select sort of the strongest program, with the strongest evidence ones, which meant that the applicant was wasting a lot of words on things that weren't going to be counted towards the assessment anyway. With the impact, there's sections in the impact, and it really was, I think, section 1, which is the rich and significant impact, which was the hardest to assess. So I suggest getting as many people, and there's quite a bit of strategy around it as well. So I suggest talking to as many people as possible, talking to your research officers, and really getting the narrative across those 3 sections right. In terms of publications, there's not much you can do about publications. It really was just, number of publications, where they were published, citations, and things like that. So there's not that much strategy there. But in terms of the impact, I think there's quite a bit of strategy that needs to be thought through.
Excellent. That's really what I'm hearing is that simple, clear and concise applications that are written at a very general levels, particularly for the knowledge gain section, because you're having a wide range of reviewers from different levels of experience looking at applications. And then also really being careful to craft that impact section narrative very, very tightly. So getting it right, picking just one program of research and really talking about that cohesive contribution that that program has made to the impact. That's really helpful. So Ash and Louise, and again, just take your turns in terms of who wants to start. Which do you think are the most crucial assessment criteria at this point in time when assessing applications and in your own applications? Because we've got these new criteria that you've mentioned around impact that have been introduced. Really how do you think these criteria are being operationalized? What are the most crucial ones that really need to be addressed?
So I do think it is. I think it is the impact section. I think that is one. The impact is. I think it's worth 20%. The impact is worth 35, and then publications worth 35. A lot of us know how to write project proposals and things like that. So having a good one is good. And your publications are your publications. There's not much you can do about it. So you need to assess yourself whether you think you're competitive in terms of your number of publications, number of first authors, and where you've published. But where there is a little bit of wiggle room and where you can apply some strategy, I think, is that impact section. If you nail that and you're looking okay with your project proposal and your publications, are there, then I think you've got a chance of getting at the leadership section. Again, there is a bit of strategy that you can only talk to what you've actually done. There's not much strategy around that, but I do think there's a few points you can score in that impact section by being strategic.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Certainly, I found the hardest section to score being the impact section as well. But after scoring it and also participating in this round, I feel like I've got a better grasp on it for the next round. I found actually one of the easiest sections to score was actually the leadership section because people were able to show the leadership that they had done, and you could easily compare and contrast leadership across the different aspects of that. That was just my personal opinion. One of the things I did want to say around the leadership section is to make sure that you include true leadership opportunities and not just opportunities that are expected by your organisation. So things such as open day appearances and that sort of thing. If you can actually craft a leadership statement around unique leadership opportunities that you've had, I feel like that would score higher.
And in terms of leadership as well, you've got 4 sections. Your leadership section, which actually map 1 to 6, I guess, different assessment criteria. Make sure you keep it fun. What I did with assessing the leadership section was give a score out of 7 for each of those 6 category descriptors, and then average them to get a total score out of 7. So if someone didn't hit one of those 6 category descriptors, then they got 0 there. So I'm not sure if assessors will take different approaches, but there are those 6 category descriptors. So just make sure you're hitting each 6 of those in those 4 sections which don't necessarily, or which don't map onto those 6 descriptors.
It's an interesting approach. I guess everyone approaches peer review in their own way as well, which is why it's such an important and independent process. So in terms of the really critical criteria, I'm hearing you guys talking about impact again, which is obviously very relevant, and the knowledge gain section too. Leadership seems like it was a bit more easy to assess from what you were saying, Ash, and then your contributions as well around looking at unique aspects of leadership, I guess, to differentiate your application from the crowd. So showing things that aren't just expected of you by your institution would be something that would be worthwhile including. And then obviously referencing all those different category descriptors, as you've mentioned, Louise. That's really helpful. So just moving on and talking a bit more about dementia. So we need to keep this at a very general level, so we can't get into real specifics, what applications you saw on panels, etc. But thinking generally, can you share your insights into improving the competitiveness of applications that might address dementia research when they're competing in major grant rounds, so more generally?
Yeah, actually, I might pass this one off to Louise, because whilst I have a bunch of dementia applications in my initial list, I had to conflict myself out of, I would say, probably 99% of them. So I didn't get a lot of chance to review full dementia applications.
So I guess we're talking at a general level then, Ash, because we don't want to know about specific applications that you would have done in your round. So if I'm happy for Louise just to answer this as well, but just in terms of any specific aspects around how people looking at dementia research might improve their competitiveness in rounds.
I was going to say, in a similar way, dementia is not one of my hasn't been something that I focused on, so it wasn't one of my keywords that I put in, so I didn't have any to assess. So again, in that sort of thinking, there's lots of things I can talk about generally in terms of what makes a good application, and specifically, I think one of the things is though is that it doesn't matter what area you are focusing on or what area you're in. You're not going to get a person, you're really unlikely to get a person on the assessment panel who's actually going to know your area or be an expert at all in your area. I didn't feel as though I was an expert in very, very few, maybe in about 20%. I felt like, okay, I've got this, I know what I'm doing here, I know what they're talking about. So, yeah, in terms of specifics around the dementia, I'm not sure if I can provide any helpful information.
No, I think that advice is helpful, Louise, because the way that the panels are constructed for investigator grants is that there is no specific area of research focus. They're split in terms of emerging leadership or leadership. So you will see a diverse range of reviewers reviewing at a diverse range of applications. So it's very much unlike ideas grants, which have their own set FOR codes that are associated with the expertise of panels, even though they're quite diverse as well. So I think keeping it quite general, in terms of having it at a pitch to a broad audience is really essential, and that applies to not just dementia research but to research more broadly. So I think maybe if we move on to the last couple of questions, what are your top tips to future investigator grant applicants? The pearls of wisdom.
My absolute top tip as a reviewer is something that's really simple for everybody to implement into their applications. And that's to tell reviewers exactly how far post-PhD you are. With the EL1, EL2 applications, everybody is somewhere between, not even got a PhD to just over 10 years past PhD, as Jen showed in the information before. But it was actually really difficult for me to score relative to opportunity if people didn't tell me what that was. So I had to go and have a look at the date the PhD was accepted, and then to work out how far post-PhD people were. I then looked at relative to opportunity statements and any sort of career interruption, and I tried to put a value on how far post-PhD individuals were. Some people did a great job of that, but I am X many years post-PhD relative to opportunity, and that really helps as a reviewer. That's my top tip.
Sorry, I was just going to ask Ash, which section of the grant would you add that in? Which part of I'm assuming the impact section, but which particular field would you put that in?
You could weave it into a range of different areas, so long as there's somewhere in that application. So, for example, if you feel like your strength is publications, for example, you could say, I am the equivalent of X many years post-PhD and have an accelerating track record of X many papers. Or if you feel like your strength is the impact, in this many years post-PhD, I have been able to show leadership in this impact, or the leadership of my program is demonstrated by this. So there's a lot of different sections that you can weave it into, and I think that's really dependent on the person and where they feel like their strengths lie.
Thanks, Ash. And Louise, what are you going to say?
That I totally agree. And especially if you have had significant career disruption. So the first thing the assessor sees is year of PhD. The next thing they see is career disruption. So if you have had significant career disruption in your most recent, so the first thing the assessor will see with your most recent career disruption, the first sentence in there should be, given my X months, X years career disruption, I am X years, X months post-PhD. And then I think repeat it as often as you want. And another thing, and apart from that, which I think is really key, and I did the same thing as Ashleigh, I went and calculated myself. I wouldn't assume your assessors are going to, and I had significant career disruption, so I know how important it is. And so I don't think everyone's going to be doing that for you. Another key thing so the sections they're not assessed together. They're assessed completely independently. So your publications, the first thing that they see, that's assessed independently of your impact, which is the next thing they say, I think it's impact and leadership, then project proposal. And they're all supposed to be assessed independently. So there's no need to link them. I also know that some assessors might go through and read all the impact sections together and then all the publication sections together. So you're not even having your application read in a full all together. So they're independent. You've got to treat them as independent. There were times when I thought, has that person said that in another section? But you've got 30 applications there. I'm not going to go back and check. So make sure that you hit everything that's relevant within that section and don't assume that it's going to be linked across them. So like key achievements and things like post-PhD career disruption, I'll repeat as often as you like. So don't repeat yourself within sections, but I definitely think across sections, repeat those sort of things.
Yeah, there seems to be a bit of a golden rule that if it's a really important piece of information that you want a reviewer to know or to remember, that I think people suggest you repeat it at least twice, maybe 3 times in a different way. So not in the exact same way that you've written it, because that will make people just skim over that section if they've read that exact sentence. But it doesn't help to craft things in, as Louise said, into separate sections.
And so when you talk about your 5 best publications, you've got a really small amount of space there. There's 2,000 characters, it's ridiculous. One good strategy might be, if it looks good for you, is to the first sentence in there to be, my age index is this is my number of citations, proportion of first author, and how many per year or whatever, given post-PhD career disruption. You can use that space there if it looks good for you. But another thing is that I think people were occasionally selecting publications there that might make their story look good along the way. So that might be related to the impact section or might be related to their project proposal. And I don't think that's necessarily a good strategy. I think pick your best publications in terms of those metrics, in terms of the citations, in terms of you being first author, and the impact, and possibly like the impact that had that you can sort of say in that section. Don't feel that you need to include them because they are relevant to other sections. Just, you know, pick independently your 5 best contributions to science there, I think.
That's really incredibly helpful advice, Ash and Louise. Just to kind of summarise the key points that you've made, you know, apart from the obvious things like keeping it simple for everyone, you really need to point out the key things around how far post-PhD you are. So don't assume that anyone's going to calculate that for you, and whether you've had a career disruption as well, to really demonstrate relative to opportunity. Then you need to make sure that you're pointing out your key achievements and reiterating them and rephrasing them where appropriate, because you can't assume that the different sections are linked or that they're going to be read consecutively as your application as a whole by any individual reviewer. So just to finish up our discussions really quickly, did either of you have anything else that you wanted to add about how to approach the peer review process, you know, from an applicant's perspective? So if we were to write our own applications and read through it, you know, what would a peer reviewer, you know, really be looking for, and whether there's anything else you want to add about the actual process that you followed, again, without referring to specific applications.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of me, I am one of those reviewers that did separate out each sections and score them independently. I thought, in my opinion, that was the fairest way to go about doing it. And it also meant that I only needed the category descriptors for that particular section at that one time. So I guess just keep that in mind. Some reviewers will do that. In terms of the application process, I guess another fairly generic tip would be to quantify every statement that you make. So instead of just saying you're outstanding relative to opportunity, tell the reviewer what makes you outstanding. So, you know, what is unique about you that makes you that person that they fund. And finally, I need to understand your research program. I know that's a bit of a reiteration, but we did get a very broad range of topics, and so I need to understand it. So my tip there would be to give it to someone outside of your field, or give it to someone outside of science and get them to have a read of it. And then also just reiterating, keeping in mind that reviewers are reviewing between 30 and 35 applications. And so you need to make it easy for them. So think about your white space when you're putting together your knowledge gain section, and also think about that narrative.
And can I just add on to what you've mentioned, Ash, as well, because there is a change this year for those who haven't seen it yet, where in the impact section, the NHMRC have allowed for an evidence box to be added. So there's now the opportunity to have a little bit of extra space to reference specific pieces of evidence throughout those different sections. So if there's certain publications that you're talking about, you can number those and then add them as numbered citations in the evidence box. So it's not just important, it's a fundamental part of the application now as well. Thanks, Ash. And Louise, just any final points that you wanted to add there?
No, look, both of you covered exactly what I would have said, and Jen, I totally agree. Treat that little that extra 1,000 characters you get for evidence as references, basically, and make sure you've got your narrative straight in the impact sections. And before you really worry about putting in all those little pieces of evidence, I think that's the most important thing, because I think what I can imagine the assessor doing is reading through those 3 sections to get the narrative, and then looking afterwards at, you know, the specific details in terms of the evidence. So don't try and split your narrative across, you know, don't try and include any of your narrative in the evidence section. Just treat it as a reference. I think that's the smartest way to do it. But otherwise, completely agree with all of Ashleigh's comments as well, that if they would be exactly my tips as well.
Fabulous. I mean, that sounds like a great use of space as well, just using it as a reference list. It's not doubling up on anything. So what I'm hearing from both of you is around really quantifying the evidence and making sure that you've done that, giving it to somebody outside of your field to read, and all those crucial key rules that we have when we're applying for any major grant scheme around making the application visually appealing and easy to digest for any reviewer, given that they're reviewing so many applications. So thank you, Ash and Louise, for your very, very helpful insider goss onto investigator grants. Very much appreciate you coming along today. We're going to flick over now to our next panel discussion, which is looking at the NHMRC Ideas Grant Scheme. So I'd like to welcome Professor Tim Carl, Associate Professor Olga Shimoni, and Dr. Marco Morsch. Would each of you like to go through and just introduce yourselves quickly, please, before we begin? Maybe starting with Tim.
Yes, so my name is Tim Carl. I'm a behavioral neuroscientist and I work at Western Sydney University. I do preclinical research into dementia therapy and I have been on the GRP for quite a few years, so I can also compare project grants with this now the Ideas Grant Scheme.
Thanks, Tim. And Olga?
Hi, I'm Olga. I'm from University of Technology Sydney. I'm actually more on technology sides. I'm nanotechnologist that apply research into dementia. I've been on to ideas panel. Last year I was on project grants panel, so I also have a direct comparison what was and what is now.
Thanks, Olga. And Marco?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hey, my name is Marco Morsch. I'm, I guess, in the transition from early career researcher to a mid-career researcher working at Macquarie University. My research focuses on cellular model of disease, and I've been on the panel this year for the first time.
Excellent, thank you. So welcome Tim, Olga and Marco. So we might just do another free-for-all discussion like we've just done with our investigator panel, so feel free to jump in if you have some burning inputs immediately. But we'll start off with thinking about, from your experience as both an applicant for either ideas or project grants, and as an assessor now for ideas grants, what to you makes a great application?
Yeah, perhaps if I start, so it's really quite similar to the investigator grants in my opinion. You have a panel of, in all likelihood, non-experts for your particular field. They have to read our panel. I think you had 60 applications to go through, at least initially. You want to have a grant which is clearly structured, easily written for the layperson, has a clear research plan, is easy to understand for non-experts. I think a lot of people don't really distinguish necessarily well between the innovation and the significant section, but these are now two independent sections. That's different to the project grant stream. And I think, of course, the feasibility section is highly important. You have to outline the feasibility of your research, but also how the team works together, and that should also include the AIs, because they are nowadays a significant part of your application.
Well, I completely agree with Tim and what's been said before, that application needs to be understood by a layperson, because this year panels were really diverse in terms of the themes around each panel. So many people in the panel weren't direct experts in a field and would rely what a spokesperson would say about your application. So the biggest change is there is no review by external assessors. So your review is done by 4 spokespersons, and as I said, they're not necessarily experts in that particular field. Most important needs to be understood. Methodology must be solid in application, and one point is important point on that is many people who applied for ideas grant, they thought that, well, I have a great idea, so I'll just put the application into ideas grant. But it's not like that. You need to have solid methodologies already developed. You need to show the feasibility of this ideas grant approach that can be done. And the most important thing was to talk about innovation. So the grants that about project that you've been doing for the last 10 years and you want to continue doing. That's not innovation that's been moved. Points are really hot topics like AI or next generation sequences or something going outside your field that's what would score for good innovation.
Thanks. Olga and Tim and Marco?
I agree very much with what has been said before. Maybe what I can add to this is that the stories of the panel, or I guess what is a good application can be quite subjective. So actually, it comes to discussions at the panel. So it's really important, therefore, to make clear to the panel what your impact is, and make it easy for the spokesperson to actually argue your case. If you have good examples, that really helps. What stood out for me for a couple of really good applications as well is that they clearly stated what is not known in the field. Not only what you've achieved, why you are the best person, but actually what's the knowledge gap and how do you address this? And is your particular focus actually really closing that gap? I thought that these applications stood really out. And as both Tim and Olga said before, make it concise. And to add to that, maybe I would say make it a coherent story. And coherent to be precise and clear, but make it a story as well. If you have the chance and can take the time to make it enjoyable to read for the panel members, you are already in a good standing. It really helps the panel to make it easy and argue your case.
That's really helpful. So from the three of you, what I'm hearing is that the coherent story of a clearly structured application that's really easy to read and it's written for a non-expert audience is quite critical in terms of community ideas. Tim mentioned something around innovation and significance and feasibility, which we might get into in our next question, because we're talking more about the category descriptors and the assessment criteria. The other things that you highlighted were that the methodology really needs to be very solid. So just having a great idea isn't good enough. You need to be able to demonstrate feasibility. And to do that, you can talk about innovation as well in terms of demonstrating the novelty of the idea that you're proposing. And Marco, what you just highlighted as well is around making the impact very clear and easy for the spokesperson to argue for your application on the panel and stating the research gap very clearly. So all very helpful advice. So just moving on to the next question now, looking at the most crucial assessment criteria when assessing applications. Can you give us some of your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so perhaps if we stay in the same order, I totally agree with Olga that I think having a great idea or an innovative idea doesn't give you the grant. In the end, I think, and I don't know if the experience of the other two panel members was different, I think it still comes back to the research quality. It has to be more than just a solid design. It has to be backed up by either published or preliminary data. So in that regard, I think the panel spent a lot of time on assessing this first part. Significance in innovation was a lot of times discussed together. And for a lot of the fields, I think people wouldn't argue about significance, especially when it comes to Alzheimer's or dementia research. Feasibility, again, it is important to outline what your team looks like and how they have worked in the past. Perhaps you know that your AIs are your supervisors, but that doesn't know that. So you have to clearly state how you're interacting and how you're working together. And in the end, I think the grants which really got the best feedback and the best scoring, most of the times the spokesperson started with, that was a well-written application, I understood it, and it was a joy to read. And I think that's what you really have to go with from the start. Make it approachable and readable by anyone, even outside the field.
Yeah, completely agree with that. Many times, project quality and feasibility were really quite interconnected. So there was also a point that we weren't sure as a panel points given to more feasibility or to project quality. So I think from my perspective, that was the most crucial part of your grant, but still don't compromise on the writing about innovation and significance. It's equally as important. And team in Ideas Grant, all the AIs are as equally important as CIs due to current reasons, and they completely agree that you need to explain exactly what's the role of AIs, and it's not just listing name on your application. And they something else that I wanted to add is track record is not discussed by the panel. So even though you can add it in the application with the sentences as published in our Nature paper or as I don't know, developed during this paper or my tenure position here and there. So it can be incorporated, but track record is not discussed. And all the applications, senior authors or ECR or MCR, they reviewed equally. And sometimes when an application was written by senior there was a generalized his application who actually be doing that work. So being looked as he was looked not based on his track record, he's been looked as a part of the team CIA.
Thanks, guys. So, you know, obviously some changes with the ideas assessment criteria compared to what we did in project grants, but I'm hearing from you that, you know, the research quality is something very important, and this was reiterated in your answer previously, in that you can't just think the idea is going to carry the application through. You need to have that backed up by publications and pilot data to demonstrate feasibility and really meet that assessment criteria. You need to be talking about what the team actually looks like, how you've worked together in the past specifically, and how you'll be working together on the project. And then also demonstrating the role of AIs and both the CI team in the application as well, because they're obviously just as important in terms of showing the feasibility that your team can do the work. Important things to note and changes of the scheme is, yes, that the track record is not included. So that's another point that Olga's raised around some of the logistical changes. And also that the assessment criteria are all interconnected, which is something very, very crucial to keep in mind as you're going through, because if you start to not convince someone about a particular assessment criteria, then you may be dragging the other ones down as well. So moving on to the next question, we're talking about dementia research. So again, just keeping this very high level in general and not referring to specific applications that you might have seen on the panel. But can you share any insights about how we might improve the competitiveness of applications that do address dementia research when they're competing in major grant rounds?
So I did some stats on what went to our panel. So out of all the applications which came to our panel, 33% initially were, at least in one way or the other, linked to dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Out of those, only 20% actually made it to the meeting in Canberra. So the overall success rate for overall grants was around 46%. So they did slightly worse than other non-dementia research grants. The ones where I wasn't conflicted, the ones we discussed on the panel, quite honestly, I don't think that panel members have a certain attitudes towards this research area. They're assessed in the same way as for other disease models or disease areas. All of those were, or the vast majority of those, was preclinical research. People obviously spend a lot of time on the validity of the models used. There were some grants where perhaps people tried to push us towards the dementia field to increase the significance score. If what you're doing is relevant across brain disorders, but it's not necessarily dementia specific, then I wouldn't try to sell it as that, because otherwise it backfires to you and it actually has an impact on your score. But I think it's really hard to dementia research applications be improved. I thought they were assessed in the same way as any other research proposal, at least on our panel.
Well, I haven't seen many applications in dementia. As I said, I more was on technology-related panel, but I've still seen few applications in the dementia. And what I say, there's no real bias or anything related against dementia or pro-dementia research. So every application was discussed and reviewed as per their merits. So there's no real insight from that.
Yeah, I agree that there's, I don't think there's anything super specific about dementia. What you'll find is that, and that's probably what Tim highlights, is that you don't want to push one field too much, because we'll have experts in the field in there, and they then in the discussion say, but yeah, it's not really what they're actually investigating, then, as Tim said, can backfire. So I wouldn't say you need to be specifically pushing it for dementia. It's more what we heard before, and what we will be hearing, what makes a good application in general. And you know, if you can obviously say that it has a high impact on dementia, that's obviously significant. But don't try to force it into that direction. A
really good point. So, you know, again, reiterating the the clarity and transparency around the peer review process, I think, is important. You know, that applications are treated equally, and also not to push for a specific area. And this is not just dementia, but more broadly. So unless your application falls within that area, you don't necessarily have to push to it. And one other thing I'd like to add is that applications are assessed based on the magnitude of the disease burden. So, you know, if an application is looking at say a rare cancer with a very small number of people who are affected versus something like dementia, which has a very you know, widespread burden of disease, that just doesn't come into play. It's about the individual contribution and impact that each application can make. So just because it affects less people, it doesn't make it any less worthy of funding. So that's just some other advice that was passed on by panel chairs. So just to conclude these discussions, I'm kind of going to wrap up the last question now, and then we'll move on to Janice's section. But can you give us any of your top tips or pearls of wisdom around future applicants applying for ideas grants?
I think it's similar to what we had for the Investigator grant, where no necessarily an expert will look at your application because don't necessarily this anymore. In terms of what happens on the panel level, your grant gets anywhere between 8 to 12 minutes discussion time. If that has to be wasted on explaining what you want to do, then you already lost the panel members. So it has to be easily written. You still have to focus on research quality, even though it is an ideas grant initiative. It's not just the idea which carries you over a scoring of 6. And as Olga pointed out, if you want to point out anything within your track record, nothing of RGMS is uploaded, so it has to go into the feasibility section. Otherwise, the panel members will not see it.
What I would say, the thing is, the most important thing that I put it on for me is, so first of all, ideas grant project must have potential to advance that field and should be innovative, but methodology shouldn't be compromised, and you'll have to have solid methodology and show feasibility. You must build a strong team, which most of them may be AIs, but you need to show how the team works together. Then format and readability of the application is crucial. A well-written grant won't get a crap science funded, but a well-written grant can easily sink a good proposal. So that's my summary for good well-written application.
Yeah, and I probably can just extend a little bit on that. I think if you have a good rationale and you can connect the different parts of your application, then you're already halfway on telling a really good story, because it will flow. It's actually really easy. I think for writing an application, what is really useful as well, give the panel members, as we heard, there's lots of non-experts in the panels, give them hooks, explain to them what it actually means. So I would suggest you summarize actually paragraphs or sections with a little sentence and say, this means that. So for non-experts that immediately see, oh yeah, okay, that is what he's telling here. And it really helps to build this story. In terms of writing, avoid abbreviations and acronyms, but don't be shy to actually state the limitations of your work as well. So it's totally fair to say what are some of the limitations of your work, because what it shows to the panel is that you have thought it through. You just don't say like, this is all perfect what I'm doing here, there's no limitations. We all know it's never the case. So if you can highlight them and say how you mitigate them, that I think makes it actually a really well thought through and good application.
Can I add about something that Marco pointed out? In the ideas grant, you have a little section that says how you manage your risk. Don't disregard this section, because panel members are really looking into how you mitigate your risks. So really think through what's are the risks involved in your project and how you're gonna manage those risks. Putting some generic statements, it's not really providing you any extra scores. It's actually kind of sinks your application down, saying, okay, so they see that concern, but they don't think through that. So it's actually getting their score one down. So really look into this risk associated with the project, especially because this project is supposed to be innovative. So there is another point that Marco mentioned yes, the best application for the panels and reach the panels are those applications that's been written as a story or with humor. And there was just a joy to read them. And those applications that were written with a really high acronym and jargon were a nightmare to review, and usually they fell before panel.
Really, really fantastic tips from Tim, Olga and Marco. I might just quickly summarise your last lot of discussions and then we can move on to the next section. So the key points I'm really hearing is around making sure that you've got a very clear proposal, because a poorly written proposal can essentially sink the grant, in Olga's words. Use hooks, from what Marco said. Explain what key concepts and terms mean and provide definitions. Use anecdotes and metaphors, add in a story, use humour, whatever you can to make your application stand out and make it more readable, and avoid things like abbreviations and acronyms and jargon as much as possible, because it makes the application so dense. Key things to note are the risk mitigation section that's been added into the scheme this year. Don't ignore it. It's okay to acknowledge the limitations of your project. It shows that you've thought about them and that it's balanced, but don't ignore it. Make sure it's included as a section and that you address this. Have a strong team and really talk about how you're going to work together. Make sure that you focus on research quality. It's very, very important. This has come up again and again throughout this discussion, that the actual idea itself and the innovation, it can't carry the grant through. It needs to have high quality research. And the track record of the team is incredibly important in demonstrating the feasibility of the application. The final comment was just around that, you know, really you're getting applications that are reviewed by a very wide range of panel members who may not specifically be from your field directly. So keep that in mind. And there has been a restructure in terms of the way the panels are organised for ideas grants compared to what project grants were, with the new super panels containing multiple FOR codes. So they're even more diverse than they've ever been. So that means your application needs to be crystal clear. So without further ado, we might just say thank you very much to Tim and Olga and Marco, and of course to Ash and Louise as well for their contribution this afternoon. And for the last half an hour of this webinar, or last 20 minutes or so, we're going to just be talking with Genevieve, who's our director of the NNIDR. Before that, and to provide some context to what Janice is going to cover, Ash is going to quickly highlight some of the results from the survey that was conducted last year on the NNIDR fellows, to give you an idea about where there's some potential gaps, so that Janice can talk about how the NNIDR can support you. So Ash, handing over to you, and I'll click through the slides.
Thanks, Jen, and what a great discussion. I certainly learned a lot in the last section as well. So I just wanted to quickly, I'm wary of time, I know we're running a little bit late, so I'm going to take 2 minutes to just talk through a survey that we ran in 2018 for the Early Career Dementia Fellows. So this was part of the establishment of the Accelerator Group. And essentially we were just interested in knowing what the fellows in 2018 were planning to do at the end of their fellowship. So on the left hand side of the screen we have a bunch of demographic information around fellows that responded to our survey. Although we were able to capture fellows across Australia and a couple of international fellows as well in these results. We had 57% of the fellows indicating that their fellowship ends in 2019. And just pulling out some really quick key messages here, 63% of the fellows that we surveyed considered it was really likely that they'd like to continue researching in dementia after the completion of their fellowship. So that's a really exciting finding from this survey. And it really highlights that the NNIDR and the Boosting Dementia Research Initiative has really done what it had set out to do, which is to pull people from other areas into dementia and hopefully retain those people in dementia research. One of the other key findings is that 70% of the fellows surveyed at the end of 2018 reported that they actually have no funded position following the end of the fellowship. We don't know that things have changed in the last 12 months or so, but it's certainly something that we need to to keep a look on and think about how we continue the Boosting Dementia Research Initiative moving forwards. So I'll just get you to click through to the next slide. So really quickly, this slide just shows some of the outputs that the fellows have had throughout their fellowship. So it's not just outputs in terms of academic outputs. We've had a range of fellows on the left-hand side engage in different media outputs. Sorry, I don't know if it's me or if everyone's slides are flicking too. But we've had fellows who've reported media outputs in television, newspaper, radio, and podcasts. And of the fellows that responded, we're doing a lot of work in this area. So the number of media engagements ranging from 4 or 5 up to 50 plus engagement in this small group of fellows. So that's another really nice outcome from the fellowship. So I'll just get you to click forwards again for me, Jen, if you can. So just as a segue into what Janice is going to be talking about, from our results, as I said, in 2018, a high proportion of our fellows did not have funded positions at the end of their fellowship. Despite that, many of the fellows would like to continue working within the field of dementia and dementia research. And that's really one of the reasons why we established the Accelerator Group, so that we can support all early and mid-career fellows working in dementia research as we go forwards. But in the interest of time, I might hand over to Janice to have a discussion around how the NNIDR can continue to support our early and mid-career researchers moving forwards.
Hi everyone. Let me first apologise for being in a public place for this webinar. It was a very quiet place when I first set up here, but it's a little bit noisier. So I hope that that doesn't interfere with our discussions. Jen, perhaps if you go to the first slide, the first thing I'd say is it's been a great session. It does show the value of sharing knowledge amongst each other, and it really goes to the heart of what the Institute was set up to do, and that is to encourage coordination and collaboration across the dementia research effort. And for those of you who are not particularly aware of the history of the funding scheme, one of the very first things we did was to invest quite strongly in early career fellowships and then later in emerging leadership fellowships. So having a strong cohort of people there to boost the dementia research effort has always been seen as particularly important. We think that the Accelerator Group is one of the success stories, and it's really great that it's driven by our members. In fact, it wouldn't work otherwise. The momentum that comes from people who are deeply grounded in the work that you're doing, it can't be replaced by an administration or even an expert group. So thank you for that. Our biggest challenge at the moment, as both Ash and Jen have alluded to, is how we actually retain and continue to build research capacity. We've pumped $200 million into the system over the last 5 years. That funding will continue to be taken up within the sector until about 2023. And of course, as we know, the earliest investments are starting to come to a close. We've been watching as closely as we can how our early to mid-career fellows are transitioning, some of whom are extending their career fellowships and talking with their universities about part-time work and so on, or getting bridging fellowships. If anyone needs that kind of advice, I've suggested to a couple of people on Accelerator Group that we set up a panel to help provide that advisory service, and it could be perhaps an extension of our mentorship work that we've been doing with early to mid-career research fellows. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that the government may be completing its investment now in the $200 million initiative, but so much more funding is coming into the system through the Medical Research Future Fund. And in particular, we're looking at the Dementia, Ageing and Aged Care mission, for which the priority setting is being done right now. So there's no need to feel too bleak about whether or not there is funding in the system. It's how we position ourselves and the sector to carry on the good work that's happening through those new sources of funding. There's a huge effort in the MRFF funding streams on translation into clinical care and practice. So some of those areas that Jen pointed out at the very beginning of the webinar around health services, for example, where the traditional funding streams have not really flown to very well. The Medical Research Future Fund will be starting to balance that out a little bit. NHMRC, of course, has its new focus on impact as well, and you've talked quite a lot about that already today. We at the NNIDR are actively talking with foundations. MRFF is favouring larger scale collaborations, innovative proposals, proposals where leveraging is achieved. So this is something that I think that the Institute has a role in supporting people to do, and it's certainly something the Institute itself is looking to do as we try to patch together a focused package for boosting dementia research into the future. Perhaps, Jen, if you change the slide. I think that's the same one. There we go. Thank you. A little bit about the pattern of funding. In 2008 to 2012, NHMRC was pumping around 27 to 30 million quite regularly through the mainstream programs into the sector. That funding is now almost doubled. We are concerned about the drop-off that could happen from 2021, and that's why we're in such active discussions with philanthropy, working with Department of Health, Medical Research Future Fund and the NHMRC to see what we can do. We believe there's an urgent need to support early to mid-career researchers, because having had that initial investment, we realise it is a really important transition out of these first fellowships and into the mid-career domain. And we also want to support new entrants and teams and emerging centres. One of the best things that has happened over the last few years is that a number of new dementia research centres have declared themselves in universities where dementia research wasn't on strategy before. So I urge you all to look around within your universities and work within those university contexts. The other areas, of course, are to look at the advanced health research and translation centres, anywhere where you can see a cluster or collaborative enterprise emerging. If you can work on larger scale proposals in a team effort, working with the people who mentor you within your university, but also not being afraid yourselves to reach out and work in an interdisciplinary way. I think you'll find in your universities there's quite a lot of support for doing that as well. Your problem is their problem, and your opportunities are their opportunities. And having those conversations locally will really make things happen. Jen, do you want to move on to the next one? So I've mentioned that a little bit already, and yes, in fact, I've covered it all, except for one thing, and that is the special interest groups that are forming within the NNIDR. So we've got about 12 to 13 groups working in particular areas of research focus. We will have someone reaching out to those groups very shortly to work with them to strategically set their agendas, to see what support can be provided, both in kind and a small injection of funding to keep things moving. As I said, the Accelerator Group is a really important example of how this can work and work well, but it doesn't have to be about career development. It can be about your area of passion, and it would be lovely to see those groups seeding these ideas for larger collaborative research projects that involve people across disciplines, across universities, and if we can get an international connection working for you, that's even better. Jen, the next one. So the things you can do: band together, co-mentor, proposal writing, get ready for interviews and learn from each other's success. Today is just such a fabulous example of that. And yeah, we look forward to supporting you because you're doing the important work to support people with dementia and their families and their carers who are really looking for breakthroughs in everything from prevention to cure and care. I wanted to end the session, or happy to take any questions, but I just wanted to end by showing you a slide now of the Medical Research Future Fund and the AMRAB priorities. You won't be able to take all of this in right now, and we are really running out of time. But I just wanted to point out that As we move into these more generic pools of funding, the dementia agenda is still very present. Obviously, we've got the ageing and aged care focus that has been recognised by government as incredibly important and will only become more important over time. But you will also see there the importance of working with developing countries, support for capacity building and so on. So when we circulate the slides and when you look at the vision, please start to think from these perspectives as well. These cross-cutting themes are the other area where you can reference to show the impact of your work now and to build programs that will achieve much greater impact in the future. They've been crafted by people who absolutely care a great deal about the future of medical research in this country, and they're very, very, very good settings to have. Jen, perhaps the financials? Yeah. So I'm sure I'm not telling many people anything they don't already know. The funding through the Medical Research Future Funding Fund has started to flow, but you'll see there that it is not flowing as particularly high levels at the moment. But flip to the next one, Jen. Sorry, is the next slide there?
So they're the only two...
Sorry, the 20 billion one, that's the one.
Yeah.
So the target of 20 billion by 2021. So the significance of that, of course, is that we're pretty well doubling the amount of funding available for medical research in this country over the next few years. So while we can be a little bit concerned that we don't have targeted dementia research funding, I think our creativity and the good work that we can all do together will see the program continuing, and we are actively seeking targeted funding as well. Is there anything that anybody would like to ask me?
So we have some time for questions now. So if you do have questions, please do post them in the group chat. And Alicia's kindly moderating them. Ash has sent a quick message out just asking if, Janice, you could possibly elaborate on what you mean by grants with leveraging input. Are you talking about industry partnerships specifically?
I'm talking about all sorts of partnerships there. So within the NHMRC schemes, when you're talking about your own input, if you have had support, from health services sites, if you are working in an area where people have co-invested either in kind or in cash, that you do need to bring that forward. And more particularly when you're putting together ambitious programs for the future, if you can demonstrate that support is available and ready and has been pledged, that will be useful. So it can happen at the individual level, it can happen at the collaborative research grant level, and of course it's happening at the institute level as well.
That's really helpful, Janice. We're just waiting for a few more questions to be asked. Perhaps, Janice, could you tell us specifically about some of the modes of support that the NNIDR might be able to offer fellows? So, if somebody is having issues, say, in securing an ongoing position or securing even some safety net funding to continue their portfolio whilst they're waiting on outcomes from their grant round. We know that a high proportion of fellows from the data Ash presented don't have ongoing positions after their fellowship's finished. So what sort of specific things can NNIDR offer to help fellows in those situations?
Well, the first thing I'd say about that is we can't do anything about it if we don't know about it. So the support and mentoring and setting up the co-mentoring and tapping into special interest groups, of course, is one thing. We can help in conversations with universities. We can help in raising the profile of individuals. And when I first took up my role, I did come around to a number of the centres, and I would have loved to have done that more often. I should be doing it more often. but please, people come to me, because that's going to be more effective. It's going to be when you need the assistance or support or advice or connections, rather than when I just happen to be randomly in town in your city. But things that we've been able to do, I always give Tuan's example here of, he was very interested in contributing to policy in Vietnam. We were able to link him up with the Alzheimer's Disease International people, make the connections to research leaders that weren't so strong for him at that point. And he was able to actually, within a very short period of time, leverage those connections in to his own research program and to actually helping Vietnam write its dementia strategy. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Sometimes we think, if it's not a funding scheme, then there's nothing on offer. But there are, obviously many things we can do, and the team is here to help. Bojana, excellent communicator. We're always looking for stories. Dementia Australia is available. The doors are open through us to Dementia Australia, and they are always looking for stories, but they come up with challenges themselves. Sometimes someone might need to do a project in a regional community or to solve a particular problem, or may want to know what the problems are that need to be solved. And those are the sorts of conversations that we can facilitate.
Thanks, Janice. And I think it's a good opportunity just to quickly ask Ash, as co-chair of the Accelerator Group, to maybe just highlight some of the other support mechanisms and development opportunities that have been available through the Accelerator Group. Ash?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'll just restart my video.
Sorry, Ash, you're muted again. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, there we go. You can hear me now?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, excellent. So yeah, I guess initially when we set up the Accelerator Group, our purpose was to advocate for the cohort of fellows that were the early career fellows funded under the Boosting Dementia Research Initiative. So our original goals were around understanding what was happening with those fellows and what their plans were following the end of the fellowship. So we got started in 2018, and basically we were a small group of fellows who came together, and each fellow took on something that they were passionate about. So I took on surveying the fellows, Jen took on some professional development opportunities and organised the Accelerator workshop at last year's ADF. Mitch and Lauren undertook peer mentoring and a mentoring program over 12 months, and Lynn also was involved in putting together some professional development webinars. Since the first 12 months had passed, we decided that it was important to extend our support and our group to include the leadership fellows. So we've now started including some of the leadership fellows on the group and looking at how we can more broadly support early and mid-career fellows working in dementia research in Australia. So I guess my message to everybody out there is to basically get in touch with us if there's things that you want or need that we can then take back to the NNIDR and advocate for early and mid-career researchers in dementia research in Australia more broadly. So yeah, that's really just a very quick recap of what we are and what we hope to do moving forward.
So I'd like to just conclude this afternoon by thanking all of our panel members, so Ash and Louise, Marco, Tim and Olga, also Janice for being very helpful and going through that information, and Alicia for being fantastic around supporting the